Hello friends, welcome to Universe of Naruto X. If you love Naruto what if stories and anime explanations, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin today's story. For a moment, neither said a word to the other, and instead the pair simply took in the silence as if it were the Sui test of melodies, a song that should be left to play without interruption. But alas, all songs must end eventually, and the silence was broken with a short cough from the whizzed leader. I hear that you were invaluable in the retrieval of one of our most prized possessions, as well directly as responds. Ibel for saving both Arakorn and Hidoken. The third recounted, taking a moment to study the young girl in front of him carefully. That is a very impressive feat for a newly graduated genin. I hope you are proud of yourself. He commended, settling deeper into his chair as they began their conversation. I did what was required of me as a kunoiki of the village. It is nothing deserving of such high praise, she argued politely, leaning back in her seat and turning her attention away from the third and towards the glass win. Dao behind him, her gaze peering out into the darkness covering the village. Anyone would have done the same in my position. I just so happened to be in the right place at the right time, she reasoned, and he let out a light chuckle in reply at the dismissive explanation. You do not give yourself enough credit. Your actions tonight surely saved many lives in the long run, and that should not be so easily overlooked. The aged leader's voice had such warmth to it that she found herself hard-pressed to believe this was the man considered to be the god of shinobi. Regardless, you will be rewarded for your actions tonight, even if you feel it is unnecessary, he explained. As you wish, Hokage-sama. She relented, but inwardly she was pleased that this venture would prove beneficial to her in some capacity, even if it was just monetarily. But I don't believe that is all you called me here for, is it? She questioned, and she noticed how he seemed to age in front of her, all but confirming her thoughts of what he wished to discuss. You have good intuition. That will serve you well. He tried to add a bit of levity to the situation with praise, though it came out far less genuine than he may have intended. But you are correct. There is in fact another matter we must discuss. His wrinkled brow creased in distaste. I believe you were informed of your status, so to speak. He prodded and she nodded quietly, keeping her eyes locked onto the darkened windows. If you are referring to the fact that I am the container for the Kaoli, then yes, Tojo took great pleasure in informing me of my burden. Though such information came as little surprise given all the evidence, and I had already deduced the truth shortly after beginning my studies on Fu and Jutsu. She admitted freely. The less that subtle glares, the name-calling, the isolation, the thinly veiled disgust I attract. Merely walking through the streets. She shook her head. All of that makes much more sense with the context of the rather large seal that's been printed onto my stomach. She sighed, and out of the corner of her eye, she caught the slight flinch he gave as she ran down some of the basic day-to-day treatment she received at the hands of the village, but pretended not to notice. The villagers are misguided. They still feel the pain of that which they've lost, and it blinds them from seeing you as you truly are. He did not approve of their actions, but there was little he could do to force them to love the girl. Free will gave them the right to feel as they pleased, even if it was detrimental. That does not excuse their actions, but I do hope you've gained an understanding of their reasoning. He spoke and she raised a brow in curiosity while a slight kindling of disbelief sparked within her. You say that as if you are implying I should forgive them, or rather as if you're asking forgiveness on their behalf. The reasons for their actions did not suddenly absolve them of responsibility for them. She very much doubted she would receive a pardon if she began to attack civilians just because she could arguably use their treatment of her to justify it. That was not how the world worked. Your reasons were irrelevant in the face of your choices, and the villagers had made the choice long ago. If I asked you to forgive them, would you? He questioned, and she had to fight down the urge to scoff at the question outright. If her present company wasn't the leader of this village and her new commander-in-chief, she may very well have laughed in his face, but she kept her composure nonetheless and settled for a small frown. True forgiveness is something to be earned, not handed out like party favors. I have no interest in seeking petty vengeance over ignorant masses, but I don't believe it should be expected of the wrong party to give forgiveness to those who have made no effort to earn it, she declared with an air of finality. It was borderline arrogant in her mind to expect that a child should need to turn the other cheek for an entire village of adults throwing a never-ending pity party. If they wish for forgiveness, they can work for it. And if they don't, then that's the choice they've made. The third fell quiet for a moment, but eventually nodded with an air of defeat. I suppose that is only fair. He conceded, though it was clear that was not the answer he would have liked to hear. Another round of tense silence arose between them, but this time it was her turn to break it. While she may have discovered her status on her own months ago, there were still blanks in her understanding that she wanted needed to be addressed, and who better than the Hokage to answer her questions. Why was I not told of my status sooner? Did I not have a right to know? She questioned evenly, no trace of anger or accusation in her words, but her eyes expressed hidden displeasure at being kept in the dark that he no doubt caught, judging by the frown that took hold over his normally gentle smile. It was a choice made for your own protection on my orders. I had hoped that if you were left in the dark about the truth, you may have been able to have a more normal childhood. One not burdened by thoughts of what you carried and what that may have meant for you. He explained, giving his own justifications for his actions, but she was left less than impressed at his reasons. No. Instead, my youth involved such childhood staples such as being removed from the orphanage at the tender age of 5 and being forced to live on my own, being isolated by the popularity on at large as if I was some sort of diseased leper, and suffering under the combined hatred of an entire village for reasons I was not deemed fit to know about. She retorted, a quiet undertone of venom tinted her otherwise monotone voice, each word cutting like daggers through the blanket of regret that seemed to drag upon his old frame. I suppose we can call that a normal childhood then? She questioned, but it was less of an inquiry and more of an accusation, a fact that was not lost on either party. I cannot tell the people how to feel. That is the curse of free will, he admitted, acknowledging that while he could create laws to enforce his will, he could do very little to change how they perceived her. Even a cage only has so much authority over the thoughts of his people. He had an answer for everything, it seemed. It was just a shame none of those answers were satisfactory in her eyes, but she had more questions, and so she was quick to rein her temper back, lest she cross a line and ruin this sea. Hans, the past cannot be changed. There is no point in dwelling on it. She let go of that thread only to grasp another. When exactly did you plan to tell me the truth? Did you even plan to tell me at all, or was I never supposed to find out? She cried, and once more she had to fight to hold back a scowl, as he seemed to hesitate in his response. That alone was far more telling of his intentions than anything he might say to her. I did intend to tell you when I felt the time was right. He sighed heavily, almost as if he knew his answer was not what she wanted to hear, and had he paid more attention, he may have taken notice of the way her fingers burrowed into the arms of her seat. That would have proven as much. I wanted to wait until you had become a chunin and you would be better prepared to handle the information rather than hamper you with the knowledge of during your time as a genin, he explained, sounding far more tired of this conversation than when they began. But she cared little for his exhaustion in the wake of her growing distaste for just how little trust she was afforded when it came to information regarding herself. There was a creature with the capability to flatten entire villages shoved within her navel, but she had to earn the right to be told that information. What if the beast attempted to escape while she was on a mission? What if a foreign nin discovered what she was and tried to kidnap her? What if she had decided she even didn't want to become a ninja? What would the requirements have been then? Would they even have bothered to tell her? Or would she have gone to her grave without ever knowing? I see. I only have one more question. Then she didn't care to debate with him any longer. He'd made it very clear that her suffering was in the name of her own benefit, and it disgusted her to even hear him speak at the moment. Why was I chosen? There had to have been other candidates that would have made better choices. Any of the clan heirs could have been used, or even a civilian family's child in a pinch. She leveled the third with a hard look. Why did the fourth pick a no-name orphan off the street to seal the Kaebi-ina? I do not know. He rested his head against the back of his chair and looked towards the picture of the man hung on the wall. There wasn't exactly much time for him to explain his thought process to me with the Kaebi bearing down on the village. I cannot say for certain his reasons for choosing you. He deflected and she fought down the urge to click her teeth in annoyance and instead kept the pressure on him. But you could guess at them. He was your successor and surely you had some idea of his motives or thought process. She pointed out, unwilling to accept such a dismissive answer at face value. As I said, there were better options available. Any of the major or minor clans could have supported a container with proper training, funds, and supervision that far exceeded anything a simple street urchin would have SS2, she reasoned. The third laced his worn fingers together in thought as he stared her down. Perhaps he feared that would create an imbalance of power within the clans. Any clan with the backing of the Kyuubi would no doubt inherit a certain amount of sway within the village. He suggested evenly, but she shook her head in dismissal of such an idea. Then, a baby born to civilian parents would have been an easy solution. They would little to no sway over clan politics. She counted, and for the first time that night, her face displayed an emotion beyond simple disinterest. Was it just conveniences? And did the fourth just grab the first child he could reach because there was no one there to deny him? No parents around to protest their baby becoming the target of the village's newfound anger, she muttered spitefully. Now, considering the validity of that argument, judging by how she was treated, it wouldn't surprise her that no loving parent would volunteer their baby for such a task. Perhaps he saw something in you that gave him confidence that you could handle such responsibility. The third interject rather forcefully caused her attention to shift back to him in surprise. After all, even on your own, you've proven to be quite talented, and your future is certainly brighter than even some of those born into more fortunate circumstances than yourself. He offered her a smile, a stubborn spirit unwilling to let others define her. I'd argue that makes you something special, even amongst your peers. I very much doubt he could foresee how I would turn out. And it does not change the fact that he still picked an orphan to endure the aftermath of his decision. She scoffed, settling down as she realized that she was quickly losing her composure, and with it the aged Hokage lost his smile. Do you hate him for his choice? He asked quietly. Hating a dead man is a waste of time. Hell never know it, and there is nothing I can do about it. She admitted, taking a moment to compose herself. He acted as a leader when his home needed it. And even as the victim of his actions, I can respect that he was willing to give his life to protect it, even if I don't agree with him sacrificing mine. So, she relented. Her feelings on the fourth were turbulent. She respected the man's power and skill without question, but his actions had damned her, and that wasn't something she was going to be quick to let go. He wanted you to be seen as a hero, to be respected for your sacrifice. He offered some defense of his successor's actions, but it did nothing to change the fact that those wishes had not been honored by the very village he'd given his life to protect. I would have settled for being seen as normal. But we often do not get what we want. She stood abruptly to her feet, seeming far more worn than when she had walked in. Is that everything you needed, Hokage-sama? I find myself somewhat drained from the night's events, she said, hinting that she was done discussing this topic for the moment. That was all. I apologize for taking up so much of your time. Once again, on behalf of the village, you have my thanks for your actions tonight. I look forward to seeing what you will accomplish in the coming years should Kami grant me that right. He gave a short, somewhat forced chuckle and dismissed her with a wave of his palm. She wasted no time in leaving his office. She needed to be alone for a bit. The rest of the week had passed without further incident, and she had spent most of it cooped up in her home. Her thoughts had left her far too distracted to do more than some light training to keep in shape. Her conversation with the third had brought some less than pleasant truths to light about how little control she seemed to have over her own life, and the nagging thought that there was even more that she wasn't being told for her own sake, as if the village had a right to deny her the right to know what she was, who she was on some convoluted basis, that those in charge knew what was best for her. When she had initially discovered her status as a container, it had justifiably left her in shock. But with that knowledge had come as a slight relief to know that the hatred directed her way was less to do with her and more to do with what she represented. She was not one to jump to conclusions, and so she had maintained some foolish hope. There must have been a practical reason that she was not told that perhaps knowing of the beast would give it some measure of power over her. However, when the discovery had provided no tangible effect upon her, she grew to question the reasons for such secrecy. The Kyuubi had made no effort to contact her, if it even could, and she saw no changes in her mental state that may have hinted at tampering of her mind. Now she knew that part of her suffering was just the consequence of some misguided ideal, a decision left to some sentimental old man who appeared far too wrapped up in his own self-righteousness to understand the reality of her situation. It was infuriating, and safe to say it had not left her in the most pleasant of moods. If you keep brooding like that, you're going to scare off your new teammates before you even meet them. A dull, tired voice broke her from her thoughts, and she was forced to forego the storm of her internal questioning for the moment. I am doing nothing of the sort, she rebuffed, opening her eyes and blinking slightly at the shift in the light before continuing. I am merely taking a moment to think upon the future, something you might wish to do as well if you ever plan to make something of yourself. She lied, easily turning the conversation away from her and onto him. HMP. That sounds like too much work. He ruminated on the idea for a moment before turning his gaze back towards her. I'd be happy if I could just live a simple life, maybe become some run-of-the-mill chin and just coast on without any trouble. He admitted, and she fought down the urge to chuckle at his rather predictable answer. If there was anything she liked about the Naruto clan's heir, it was that he was consistent almost to a fault. It was truly a shame he had no motivation to push himself, but there was still time for him to discover and what it was that he truly wanted out of life. It is generally those who do not seek a challenge that most often encounter them, she pointed out, resting her palm against her cheek as she watched those of her class who managed to graduate chatter amongst themselves, anxiously awaiting the team assignments. Better to be prepared for adversity before it arrives, lest it overwhelms you, she recited. It was a line she'd read while studying a bit of the second's history. Shikamaru, however, did not seem to care much for it, though, managing to slump further into his seat, if that was even possible. Can't you ever humor me and let me dream in peace? He groaned, slouching in his seats. It's like you enjoy stressing me out, he grumbled. And this time, she failed to stop the light chuckle that bubbled out of her chest at his whining. Perhaps I do, she mused, smirking slightly at the look of resignation that settled upon his face. I believe it was you who said I was a what was the word you used again? She paused in faux thought before letting out a sly smirk and raising a brow in mock recollection. Ah. Yes, a sadist. And he nearly slammed his head into his desk in reply, annoyed at both himself, having said it, and her for having remembered that. You are a seriously troublesome woman. He glared at her, or at least as much as Naruto could glare before he sighed and tucked his head into his arms, having their conversation on a quiet but light-hearted note. It was a quaint distraction, and they stayed like that until Aruruka arrived. You all here and on time. That good. It's important for a ninja to be punctual and prepared. He nodded in approval before stepping towards the center of the room and clearing his throat. She noticed that he had healed up rather well. There was still a little swelling around where he'd taken the worst of Mizuki's assault, but it was difficult to notice without looking for the signs. Before I begin announcing the teams, I ask that you bear with me for a few moments to speak to you one final time as your teacher. He took a pause and a hush fell over the room, imparting respect towards the man who had instructed them over the past 4 years. It is hard to convey how proud I am of all of you. He started, taking a moment to send each and every one of them a look of pride. Just as you all have learned from me, I have also learned from you. Each of you has taught me a lesson that I will carry on forever. And in that way, you will always be with me. As both my precious students and now as my treasured comrades, I only want the best for all of you. And sir, I want to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart for everything you have imparted upon me. He declared, giving him a deep bow of respect as the class erupted in cheers and tears. Even she had to admit she was somewhat moved by the sentiment he managed to convey with a few simple words. She almost felt bad she'd allowed him to be beaten. Almost. He gave them a bright smile and pulled out a list. Thank you again. Next, I wish to acknowledge the efforts of those students who scored highly on the final exam as well as throughout their time here. He said, and another hush fell over the room as everyone waited to see who had earned such honors. Some looked hopeful while others who knew they had not done well seemed to sink into their seats already knowing that they were not among such a group. Starting off, we have third place. There was actually a tie here. So I will present both students here. Congratulations to Sakura Haruno and Shino Aram. He announced, sending both nods of respect for the efforts. You both did very well, but I believe you are both capable of far greater things. So don't ever settle for anything less than your best. There is always room for improvement, so don't neglect your training. He advised, and both students nodded, each promising to heed his advice. Coming in at the number 2 spot was none other than Sasaki Uchiha. He announced, drawing a few cries of disbelief from the boy's more adamant supporters, that the Golden Prince could be anything less than number 1, and a GHT narrowing of the eyes from the Uchiha himself. You had nearly perfect marks in every area, which is a testament to your constant training and drive. If you continue as you have, I see a very bright future for you. Sasaki, for his part, appeared as if he wanted to say something, but instead bit his cheek and let out a muted thank you, returning to his brooding. But there was a tightness to his posture that revealed he was not exactly pleased with the outcome. Lastly, we have the number 1 spot in this class's Rookie of the Year, Natsumi Uzumaki, he revealed, and all eyes quickly shifted towards the petite Uzumaki, who appeared unfazed by the revelation, barring a small smirk that graced her feature. You've demonstrated excellence in every area, and even gone beyond that which was required of you. I don't think anyone can claim you haven't earned it, and so it truly is my honor to present you with the title. He gave her a genuine smile, perhaps the first she'd ever received from him, and despite herself, she offered one of her own a small token of respect and appreciation. They may not have had the best relationship, but he'd always been fair with her, which was more than she could say for most. That said, I want to be clear that this moment does not define any of you. He turned his attention back to the rest of the class. I know that you are all more than capable of so much more, and this is only a brief second in the journey that is the rest of your lives. The person you are today does not have to define who you may become tomorrow. Always strive to be better, be it as a better person or a better ninja. He left them on those final words for a few minutes, allowing the atmosphere to settle before speaking again. I think I've borrowed enough of your time now, so let's begin. The teams were finalized by the Hokage himself, so don't go complaining to me if you don't like your team, he warned, sending certain individuals parting looks before pulling up his list. Team 1 shall be. She only half listened as Aruka slowly went down the list, keeping a mental note of who ended up where, but it was only when she heard the names of the more prominent figures in her year that she tuned back in. Team 7 will consist of Sasaki Uchiha, Sakura Haruno. A pause had to be taken in light of the girl's victory cry and the subsequent groans of disappointment from the rest of the fan club who were now glaring daggers at the pink-haired female and Shino Aram. He finished and quickly moved on for everyone's sake. Team 8 will consist of Ka Inazuka, Hinata Hyuga, and Natsumi Uzumaki. He continued, taking a moment to spare a glance at the trio before moving on to the rest of the team announcements. Team 9 is still in circulation, so that just leaves Team 10, which will be made up of Enino Yamanaka, Choji Akamaiki, and Shikamaru Nara. He concluded, putting the list away. Your new teachers will be swinging by to pick you up over the course of the next hour, so keep your ears open and don't wander off, he warned before granting him a parting smile. I look forward to seeing you all again. Be sure to give it your best. With his piece said, he quietly left the classroom, leaving them to discuss their new arrangements amongst themselves. Troublesome. I would end up on a team with Ino, Shikamaru grumbled, stretching himself along the length of his desk as he considered his new team. Our parents probably had something to do with it, he grumbled. He didn't mind being with Choji at all, but Ino was a pain in the and no doubt there was going to be a lot of shouting in his future. Given your parents' success, it's not surprising the village would like to try and recreate such a famous team, she supplied, having already guessed something like would happen from the outset. Then again, not all outcomes can be recreated so easily. So, I suppose we shall see in time if you'll live up to their legacy or not. Just because the team had worked once before, it did not mean it would work again. But in the same vein of thought, perhaps it might. It was too early for her to say, HMP, what about your team? He turned his attention down below towards how do you feel about being paired with Ka and Hinata? He asked, curious to know her own thoughts on her soon-to-be partners. It would be remiss of me to judge them too harshly so soon, but I must admit they would not have been my first choices. She stated bluntly, eyeing up both her would-be teammates analytically. That said, there were far worse options, and I am confident that with enough time, I can break them down and rebuild them into something more fitting for my needs. She surmised, either missing or ignoring his deadpan stare at her choice of wording and her idea of how a team should function. You aren't supposed to break your teammates. You know that, right? he pointed out. If there is room for improvement, then it is necessary. She rebutted, not at all bothered by his exasperation. Potential left untapped as potential left wasted. Just be thankful we were not paired together, or I would have done the same with you. She admitted shamelessly, causing a shiver to run down his spine at the thought of having to meet her expectations. Ino may have been bossy, but other than being loud and a pain in the she was pretty much harmless. Natsumi, on the other hand, and just like that, my team suddenly doesn't seem so bad. He amended, and she laughed lightly, sparing him a passing glance as she stood up from her seat and began to make her way down to her own team. Don't worry, Naran. I will make sure to check in on you every so often to measure your progress. I doubt I can rely on Yamanaka-san to properly motivate you, so as your comrade, I suppose that duty falls to me. She gave him a smile that should have been reassuring, but instead only made his hairs on his neck stand on end. Her smile was full of teeth that warned him just exactly her checking in would entail. His body hurt already. Why was it that his life always had to be so damn troublesome? Hello, Haugen. Would you mind if I take this seat? Hinata floundered at the suddenness of her request for a few moments, her pale lavender eyes darting quickly between the open seat by her side and the now waiting form of her new teammate. Before she realized that she had yet to answer, she quickly squeaked out a small no, and without wasting a moment, Natsumi had sat herself down into the open spot by her side without so much as a care in the world, as if her asking was more a formality than anything else. And given what she knew of the girl, that was likely true. Before she could speak, Natsumi turned to her and her voice died inside of her throat as she was pierced by sharp blue orbs. She felt as though she was being measured. No, that wasn't quite the word for it. Perhaps dissected, like everything she was and would be was suddenly being combed over with a fine wire brush, and her breath caught in her lungs for a few moments as silence passed between them. Then Natsumi spoke. It appears as though we will be working together for the foreseeable future. Given that knowledge, I wanted to know your thoughts on me and Inuka-san. She rested against the back of her chair, but never took her eyes off the meek girl. Please be honest. I wish to remove any obstacles to our success early on. Hinata for her wasn't sure how to respond, and it was only a small moment of silence that she began to speak for herself. Ow. I'm not sure what you would like me to say, Natsu. I mean, Uzumaki-san. She cursed herself for her slip-up, but to her surprise, Natsumi did not appear bothered by the use of her name in such a familiar way. You may refer to me by my first name if you wish, she said dismissively. As for my question, I wish to know what you think of me and Inuka-san. Do you have any problems with either of us? She amended, and Hinata immediately shook her head as if scandalized by the very thought. And no, not at all. I mean, I don't have any problems with either of you. She seemed embarrassed to speak, but she tried to convey her sincerity in her words. It was not in her nature to seek conflict with others, and so she was quick to overlook any flaws in the name of avoiding confrontation. Thing Natsumi knew, but did not comment on for the moment. I see. That is good. Natsumi nodded, but as always, her true feelings were unreadable, and that left Hinata a bit out of sorts, unsure if her answer was received positively or not. Hey, you two holding a meeting without me? A boisterous voice interjected, turning the gaze to the source. Car's rough and grinning face greeted them, the panting form of his pup sitting tucked away under his hood, staring at them curiously as his master crossed the distance between them to join in on the conversation. I assure you, it was not our intention. I had planned to reach out to you as well. Inuka-san, she confessed, taking a moment to study him as he hopped onto the desk, using it as a seat to settle in between the two. It would be rather unproductive of me to exclude you given our new partnership. Right, he sometimes forgot that she talked like that. Anyway, you can just call me Kayano. Inuka-san is kind of stuffy for my tastes. He complained, frowning at the overly formal way she addressed him. She acted like they were strangers or something. Sure, they weren't exactly friends or anything, and to be honest, he thought she was pretty weird, but still, 4 years in the same class seemed like long enough to be on a first name basis. Very well, Khan, it is. She seemed to test the words before nodding and turning to Hinata. I suppose it is only fair, I ask, if you would prefer I use your clan name or your first name. It was becoming clear to her that her perception of their relationship may not extend both ways. Perhaps Shikamaru had a point when he said she was often too rigid in her thinking. Hinata is fine, but whatever you are comfortable with is okay. The Ash said, and once more she nodded in acknowledgement. Before they could continue their conversation further, the sound of the classroom door sliding open interrupted them, and a lone figure strode calmly but confidently into the room. A stunning kunoichi with raven black hair that reached down to her back and sharp ruby eyes surveyed the now silent Rue. She definitely stood out. Her outfit consisted of a battle dress made of white bandages and mesh underneath that left just enough to the imagination without actually revealing anything. Even the way she carried herself drew eyes to her. There was an air of womanly elegance to her that put the girls to shame. A true femme fatale teammate. Follow me, she instructed before turning on her heel and walking out of the room without so much as another word. Well, she would give her points for style if nothing else. Come on, our sensei is waiting. She wasted no time standing up from her seat and making her way to the door. Her sudden movement kicking KBA and Hinit out of their own stunned silence and into gear as the two scrambled after both the blonde and their new sensei. Oi! Don't leave us behind. Damn it, P. Please wait. They were going to need some work. Let's begin with introductions. While I'm sure you three are familiar with one another, I want to get to know a little bit about each of you before we begin. The Jonin explained, eyeing each one of them for a moment before allowing an inviting smile to grace her features. I suppose then that it's only fair if I start being the odd one out and to give you all an example of what I'm looking for. My name is Kurinayao Yuhi. She introduced herself with a kind smile. I have a few hobbies that I enjoy, such as reading and some light gardening, though sadly I don't have as much time for the latter as I used to with my new duties. My dislikes would have to be those that look down on others for superficial reasons. Kunoichi who do not take their training seriously, fangirls and perverts. She paused for a moment on that last point as if upon saying it something or someone very specific popped into mind, but she quickly continued. While I am competent in the basic shinobi disciplines, my main talents lie in genjutsu, and my goal for the foreseeable future is to help each of you in becoming an excellent shinobi in your own right. She finished giving each of them a small nod and allowing them a moment to digest the information. Who would like to go next? They looked between each other for a split second before Ka raised his hand and they turned their attention onto him. All right, my name is Ka Inuka and this is my partner Akamaru. He grinned and the pup in question peeked out of his fur hoodie to greet them with a small bark and a matching smile. I guess my hobbies would be training with Akamaru, hunting with my mother, or exploring new places. I don't really dislike much other than cats. His face scrunched up as he thought about the mean little furballs, and the rest of them had to hold back a small chuckle at the almost stereotypical nature of his dislikes. I would say that I'm pretty strong in taijutsu, and Mom says that I'm making good progress with our collaborative techniques. My main goal for the future is to become a hunter. Nin. He finished and Karani hummed with approval. That is a good goal and with your skills, it's almost certain you'll have a talent for it. Just don't slack in your training. The path to becoming a hunter nin isn't easy, so you better be prepared, she warned. But she didn't dismiss his dreams before turning her attention towards her two female students awaiting the next speaker. And to their collective surprise, Hinata coughed into her hand, taking the initiative to speak next. Anno. My name is Hinata Hyuga. She gave a small formal bow of her head in greeting. My hobbies, I suppose I rather enjoy flower pressing and tea ceremonies, she admitted, blushing slightly at the strange looks her teammates sent her way, and she quickly averted her eyes. My dislikes are those that abuse others weaker than themselves, bullies, and unnecessary violence. I am passable in my clan's taijutsu, and using my byakugan, she seemed to hesitate for a second, but quickly pushed on. My goal for the future is to remove the divide within my clan A and become a worthy clan H head. She finished and Karani nodded. That is very noble of you and I sincerely hope you can accomplish that. She encouraged truthfully. Hinata blushed but allowed a small smile to creep onto her face and Karai turned to her final student who seemed lost in thought before she noticed that the group was waiting on her and snapped back to the present. My name is Natsumi Uzumaki. She introduced taking a brief glance to note any visible reactions to her name. However, she found none, and so she continued, my list of hobbies include training, reading, practicing my calligraphy, and recently I've taken up a small bit of gardening as well. She rested her cheek upon her palm in thought of how to proceed. She was not used to introducing herself like this. My dislikes would have to be the willfully ignorant bigots, those that would waste my time, and many other things that would take too long to cover. I am well rounded in most standard ninja arts, but I specialize in medical enjutsu, fujutsu, and enjutsu specifically. She admitted, earning looks of surprise from her teammates and one of intense interest from her new sensei, but she paid it no mind. My goal for the future is to discover a certain truth and to leave my mark on the world. She finished cryptically. Kurenai was silent for a moment, weighing the girl's words in her mind, and her thoughts strayed back to a conversation she'd had with the third and the reasons she'd been assigned as T. Genturki's sensei as opposed to more fitting options. Hello, Kurani. I believe you wished to speak to me about the arrangement of your team. The third laced his fingers together as the newly minted Jonan stepped deeper into his office and towards his desk, a small frown marrying her natural beauty. Why, as she fidgeted ever so slightly in front of him, indicating that she wasn't exactly comfortable with the coming topic of conversation. Yes, I wished to understand why my requested formation was denied. She confirmed his suspicion as politely as she could. I recall that Kakashi wanted Uzumaki-san for his team, but you gave him Shino Aram and transferred her onto me instead. She didn't understand the logic of the choice. There wasn't a conflict of interest, and in her opinion, Shino would be a much better fit on her team than he would be on Kakashi's. Was there an issue with my request? The third shook his head. No. In fact, on paper, your suggestion may perhaps have been the most solid of the choices presented, and if the situation was any different, I would have happily granted your request. He admitted, leaving her slightly stunned at the ease at which he admitted it. But before she could voice her confusion on why he denied her wish, he continued. However, recent events have made me rethink many of my choices, and I now believe that Natsumi would be better suited to a sensei like you. He informed her, if I may, how would I be beneficial to someone like her? She was more than a bit skeptical. Kakashi has far more experience than I do, and if their profiles are to be believed, he would have far more to teach her than I would. It wasn't that she had anything against the girl by any means. If anything, she respected her commitment to the shinobi arts, but she was a genjutsu specialist, and the Genturki had expressed little to no interest in the illusionary arts, according to the reports they had been given. She was however hinted to have a budding talent for enjutsu, and Kakashi was the foremost expert in that field given his circumstances. Those are all valid points, and if I thought young Natsumi was in desperate need of teaching, then you would be correct. He conceded, but as he spoke his gaze grew tired and unfocused. However, she has more than proven that she is quite capable of teaching herself with only minimal outside assistance from others. And I'm certain she will reveal more of her talent in the coming months. The reality is she doesn't need someone cramming jutsu into her day after day. At least not at the moment. He gave her a grandfatherly smile, one that in the past had reassured her, but now left her feeling a sense of growing exasperation. What she needs right now is someone she can trust. That was why she'd been chosen. Her job wasn't just to teach the girl, but also to be something more than just a stranger or a passing acquaintance. Kakashi was friendly enough, but the man had his own demons, and he was reluctant to dig deeper than he had to with people. Probably a way to avoid creating more painful attachments, and that made him ill-suited to the task of connecting with her. Asuma was a bit better in that department, for sure, but there were things he just wouldn't be able to connect with, and he'd already been promised to the next generation of Enoch Shikacho, so he couldn't do it. As for the rest of her colleagues, well, she knew there was some bias against the girl, even amongst the Jonan ranks, which she thought was petty, and so it seemed the job would fall to her. As with anything, she would try her best. But after only a few minutes of looking into those analytical blue eyes, she quickly reasoned out that it would take more than a few smiles, kind words, and some soft praise to build that bridge. That didn't mean she was giving up, though, either. That's certainly a unique goal. It's certainly not easy, but judging by what I've heard, you are certainly on the right path, she said, and the blonde merely raised a delicate brow ever so slightly in curiosity, but still offered a stiff word of tea. Hanks before falling silent, turning the focus of the conversation back onto her. That was very informative, and I thank you all for sharing. Now then, I think it's only right that I admit something I've been keeping from you that is going to stress our working relationship a bit, she admitted. And initially each tuned in to hear what she had to say. You three are not actually genuine just yet. She reveals, and like a switch being flipped, curiosity turned into indignation, disbelief, and a slight undercurrent fear. What? Ha shouted in atop his head. Akamaru yipped in anger. But we passed the test. We got our headbands. Sensei, what are you saying? Hinata pressed her fingers together nervously, and her previous smile dissolved into a frown of worry. To her growing surprise, Natsumi said nothing. Her face gave away very few hints to her internal thoughts, but she didn't seem fazed by the abrupt revelation, almost as if she was expecting it. She was starting to suspect the girl knew far more than she let on, but she couldn't prove that, and it wouldn't matter much in the long term if they passed. She would have to question her later when they were on better terms. But for now, she focused on addressing the concerns of her other potential students. The academy exam was just a preliminary test to weed out those who didn't meet the most basic requirements to become a ninja. Those who did not possess the most basic knowledge necessary, those who were not physically fit enough, or those who lacked mastery of the most fundamental skills were removed. Leaving only those candidates who could be trained further. She explained among even that group more tests must be conducted to ensure that only those who are fully prepared receive the best access to the village's resources. So what does that make us? Hinata forced out. If we aren't genin, what are we? You three are something in between normal civilians and officially recognized genin. Where you go from here depends on how well you do on my test, she revealed, giving them each a serious look. Each jonin sensei has a test for their students. Those that pass will truly graduate and become genin. Those that don't will be sent back to the academy to try again next year, she said bluntly. Wait, so if we fail, we have to wait a whole year to try again? Hei growled at the idea of not only having to sit through another year of lectures, but the embarrassment he'd have to carry from failing would shame him forever in his mind. What is this test? Natsumi questioned suddenly, her calm voice undercutting Ka's anger and Hinata's worry as the other two hushed by the seeming hint of confidence in her question. You said each sensei has their own test. What is it that we have to do to pass? She reiterated, leveling a narrowed glare at the raven-haired Jonin Kerr, and I in turn stared her down for a moment before answering. My test is not as convoluted as some of my comrades. All you have to do to pass is track me down and capture me within 2 hours of this moment. She explained, and the trio blanched at the relatively simple task. Tall? Hinata questioned. That's all, she nodded, crossing her arms with a smile. Do you think you are up for it? But you're already here, Ka said, pointing out that they had the advantage right now. But to their surprise, the jonin in question merely laughed. Am I? Ruby eyes flashed with amusement, and the world around them began to shift. The quaint little dango shop that she'd led them into for their first meeting suddenly falling apart around them. Sanded wooden walls crashing down to reveal large oak trees. Polished tile flooring replaced with dirt and wild grass, and the gentle lights of the establishment replaced with shining sunbeams peeking through the treetops down into the open clearing that housed them. It was like a veil had been lifted from over their eyes as everything came back into focus, and they were suddenly very much aware of a discomforting truth. They were out in the middle of nowhere. Genjutsu, Natsumi muttered, a mixture of begrudging respect and annoyance in her voice as she realized that they had been trapped in nothing but an illusion this entire time, like blind rats they'd played right into her hands. Worst of all, she hadn't even noticed the transition. It was like her mind had locked away her memories from after she'd walked out of their classroom and simply filled in the blanks for itself. Well played, Yui-san. She clicked her teeth and turned to her teammates, who were still recovering from the rather jarring shift in perspective. She would need their help if she wanted to pass. She was no tracker, and it would be foolish to abandon the tools she'd been given. That's a bullshit, Ka stomped his foot in irritation, while Hinata quietly looked down at having been so easily trapped. Her clan was known for being resistant to genjutsu, but she'd gone and wandered into one without even knowing it. It is concerning how easily we were caught in her illusion, but complaining won't help. She shook her head and stepped towards them, turning her eyes towards the ring of trees that surrounded them in suspicion. The test has started, and we don't have the luxury of lamenting our failure at the moment. Right now, our objective is clear. We must find Yui-san and capture her before our given time is up. We are in a random clearing. You do see that, right? Car pointed out, and she fought the urge to roll her eyes at the obvious statement. She had her work cut out for her if his ability to think was so easily disrupted, but she didn't have time to point that out. We also happen to have two trackers who can begin to point us in the right direction. She countered sarcastically before turning to Hinata, who jumped at the intense gaze leveled upon her. Hinata-san, what is the range of your Bakugan? She inquired, wondering just how much ground the demure Haug could cover. Her textbooks mentioned that some users could cover miles with their sight, but she doubted that would be the case here. Hinata floundered in her answer for a few seconds before responding. Or about 60 meters, she answered, and Natsumi nodded. That wasn't as nearly wide as she would have liked, but it was better than what she had, so it would have to do. At least they would have ample warning if an ambush came their way. Good. Begin scanning the surrounding area and see if Yui-san is within your range or if there is anything around us. T might hint at where she might have gone. She instructed and didn't even wait for an answer from the Hyuga Aries before turning towards her second resource. While she is doing that, I need you to be on the lookout for anything you can use to track her down. Be it footprints or a scent we can follow, there has to be some identifier we can make use of, she ordered. But unlike Hinata's quiet acceptance, Ka instead shot her an annoyed look at the sudden demand. Hold on, who put you in charge? He frowned at her. If this is a tracking exercise, then either me or Hinata should take the lead, not you, he pointed out, and she had to resist the growing urge she felt to knock him upside the head. Of all the times he could choose to start challenging authority, he had to choose right now while their futures were on the line. Did he not see there were more important matters at hand? We do not have time to debate this. Yes, I am not a tracker. However, my skills will be invaluable when it comes time to actually capture her. Something you'll see when the time comes. But for right now, I need you to work with MS to pass. It doesn't matter who says what first. If the actions taken are all the same in the end, probability makes it highly likely that we would have come to the same plan of action regardless, so it's irrelevant who was in charge. She noted, folding her arms across her chest. Now, unless you want to return to your clan as the failure who could not even track a single target, I suggest you listen up and play to your strengths. She finished, sending him a glare that just dared him to say otherwise. Hay flinched a bit of the heat behind that look, and internally, he had to admit that the idea alone was almost disgraceful. Not to mention, he could already hear his sisters teasing and the grilling his mother would give him when they found out. He'd never be able to live that down. Fine. He broke away and gathered himself before she noticed his features sharpen ever so slightly, his nose twitching as he began his own search, and she allowed a silent sigh to escape her lips. This was no doubt going to be a problem in the future, but so long as it was after they had passed, she could afford to deal with it later. She was interrupted from her thoughts by a light tapping upon her shoulder, courtesy of Hinata. Natsumi-san, I cannot see any chakra signatures nearby that could be her. Hinata admitted somewhat shamefully, but quickly perked up with more news. But I did spot a thin trail of chakra residue headed west. Perhaps that might be her. She relayed, and Natsumi smirked with approval. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was far better than nothing at all. However, before she could give the order to move out, Ka interjected. I caught a scent that doesn't fit in the forest. I don't know for sure if it's hers, but it's definitely not something native to the area, and it's trailing to the east of our position. He relayed, and her smirk dropped like a stone skipping across a river. Of course, it wouldn't be that easy. While they could technically investigate both leads, they would have to split up, and both Hinata and Ka could only follow one path. Not to mention that she couldn't follow either without them, meaning that one of them would have to go alone, which left them vulnerable. The chakra residue is beginning to fade. Hinata informed reluctantly, as if she knew such information would only prove more stressful, but she had no choice. The veins around her eyes bulging as she tried to memorize the path of the slowly dispersing energy trail. I don't know how much longer I can follow it, she admitted, drawing an aggravated sigh from Natsumi, who quickly turned towards her other teammate. Hey, the trail is faint. He cut her off before she could finish, already guessing what she was going to ask. It'll mingle in with the smells of the forest soon enough, and I doubt even Akamaru would be able to find it again if we don't follow it soon. He noted, already seeing the dilemma that they were faced with, while she cursed under her breath. They couldn't follow both trails without splitting up, and they were on a time crunch. If they didn't make a choice soon, they would lose both of their leads and be left with nothing. That was unacceptable. She could flip a coin, but even then, there was a 50-50 chance of either success or failure, and she wasn't a fan of those odds. She fell silent in thought for a moment, weighing up her options and going over the information. While off to the side, Hinata and Kaa awaited her deliberation with increasing anxiety. She had appointed herself leader for the moment, and so, like it or not, it was her call to make. She clicked her teeth after a moment of thought and spun on her heel towards the Hyuga Aries. Hinata, guide us along the residue trail. She ordered. She would trust her gut instincts. Why that way? Kaa asked, but followed along regardless as the trio began to rush through the forest, with Hinata leading the way as she followed the thin string of azure energy that wound a path through the forest. Unseen by her teammates, she of course had her own questions, but in fear of failing in her assigned task, stayed silent as Natsumi and Kaa followed up from the rear. It's not a perfect guess, but working with what we know, there is a far higher chance this is the correct path. She began to explain her reasoning. Yui-san is clearly gifted with genjutsu and deception. And given that she trapped us all without any of us noticing, I do have to entertain the idea that this is yet another trick. However, like most jutsu, genjutsu is still chakra-based at its core, which gives far more credence that the chakra residue is a remnant of the technique she used to capture us. She reasoned, drawing surprised looks from Kaa and Hinata, who hadn't considered that. By that logic, it seemed almost too easy to figure out which path to follow. Putting Hinata-san in the lead is also most beneficial to us as a group. She continued, the Byakugan has a natural resistance to genjutsu, which means we are less likely to be fooled again, though we must still be careful. As I very much doubt Kurana's skills can be so easily overcome, she warned. That makes sense, Anno W. What will we do when we find her though? Hinata asked, wondering what Natsumi's plan was once they had located their target. Assuming she doesn't give up immediately upon being found, chances are we will have to engage her directly in combat, she reasoned. Assuming that Kurana would also be testing their fighting ability as well. Given that our task is to capture her, that leaves most of the burden on myself, and Hinata-san is not suited to the task. She admitted bluntly, causing the Inuzuka's brow to twitch. Hey, he growled. What is that supposed to mean? That was not an insult. Of the three of us, you are simply the least efficient when it comes to restraining a target. You'd have to either maul her or pin her, and neither of those are likely to happen given the difference in skill. A pin is useless if she can trick you into letting her go. And even if we entertained the idea that you could somehow beat a Jonin in combat, we'd have little use for a sensei who is a single gust of wind away from falling apart. She dismissed, making it clear that it wasn't that he was useless, but right now they needed more fitness. Shutting down her chakra flow will rob her greatest strength. So getting Hinata-san in close is our best bet. Your job will be keeping her distracted enough for us to do that, and I will act as a support for both of you since my skills can complement both tasks. She explained, so with a distraction and Hinata as our hidden weapon. He simplified and she nodded. Essentially, though, either myself or Hinata-san could subdue Sensei, it would be better if she were to do it. I will assist you where I can in keeping her open, and if the chance presents itself, disable her if possible. Before their conversation could continue, Hinata spoke up once more. I am detecting a lot of chakra in a clearing up ahead. Like the entire area is covered in some kind of chakra mist, she explained, and Natsumi narrowed her eyes. I can't fully see through it either, she added, straining her eyes to peer into the depths and frowning as her best efforts failed to pierce the blanket of swirling energy. A trap most likely. It stands to reason that she'd have some tricks up her sleeve that might even work against your Bakugan. She clicked her teeth and paused, prompting the rest of her team to stop. Kaa, can you sense anything? Is that smell from earlier around here? She questioned, and he took a moment to sniff the air before, and a curious expression arose on his face. Yes, but also no. His face crinkled like he was lost in deep thought. I am getting something, but it's not the same scent I got before. This one is more fruity, I guess. The other one was more metallic. He struggled a bit to place the smell. It's sort of like wild berries, and it also leads straight ahead. Natsumi hummed. Possibly some kind of soap or shampoo. Yuhi-san did appear to possess well-maintained hair and skin after all. She muttered her thoughts aloud but snapped back to attention soon enough. Hinata, does the trail stop at that clearing? It doesn't branch off in any other direction. She questioned, and Hinata paused to look around, scanning the air around the pocket of chakra. I don't see any other trails but they may be hidden because of the fog. She explained, knowing that large sources of chakra could actually smother smaller ones if used correctly. So, it is likely that she is hiding somewhere within that mist. I don't know how much chakra Yui-san has, but she can't possibly maintain that fog without being somewhere nearby. She guessed it was just unrealistic given how Hinata had described it. The question is, do we risk it and walk into such a blatant setup? There was something to be said about intentionally springing a trap, but what choice did they have? So, what's the plan now? Ka asked, assuming they would have to restructure their old one. But Natsumi simply shook her head. The plan remains the same, she declared, stepping forward as she stared off towards where she knew Karana was waiting for them. I'm not fond of going in loud, but we can't afford to give her a single inch. We'll punch a hole right into her trap and corner her before she can escape, she said, turning back to her team. Hinata-san, you will hang back and circle around while Ka-san and I draw her attention, while I would advise moving through the mist. You are the most suited to do that, so use it as extra cover is needed, and when an opening presents itself, move in. We'll drive her towards you, so make sure to get into a good spot. She explained, and Hinata nodded. Good, Kai-san, you will stick with me, and we'll lead the opening attack no matter what. Do not give her room to breathe. We need to keep her attention for as long as we can without tipping her off to Hinata's presence. She ordered, and he nodded. He wouldn't muck it up now that they were so close. If that is understood, let's begin. I wonder what's holding him up. Karani pondered this question as she sat within the deep haze of her own jutsu. She had expected him to find her far sooner, but the first hour was nearly up, and she hadn't heard so much as a peep from them. Perhaps they'd followed the wrong trail, which, if that was the case, would cost them dearly for time, but that was part of her test, so nothing could be done about that. Her test wasn't the hardest. She knew that Kakashi's bell test had a record failure rating, and even Asuma had mentioned he had a rather difficult test in store for his team, but she was a bit laxer. She wanted to test what she considered core needs for a ninja, such as problem solving, reasoning and deduction, risk assessment, resource management, and should they make it that far combat capability. Her test was simple, but it touched upon points that she valued, and that was enough for her. Plus, she had a good feeling there was more to her team than she'd seen. Wind-style wandering gales. Her thoughts were quickly thrown to the literal winds as a sudden stream of rushing air burst through the whitish haze that surrounded her, the careful net she'd cast being scattered high into the sky in a rushing sweep of gale forces. She clicked her teeth as she remembered that Natsumi was marked with a talent for Enjutsu. But even so, she hadn't expected the girl to have a wind jutsu in her pocket. Bringing her chakra to bear, she quickly flooded the mist once again, forcing it to begin retaking the lost territory. Their assault had begun. Natsumi poured chakra into her lungs as she continued to blow the mist away from their position while Ka and Akamaru rushed in alongside her. Already, she could see the haze trying to reclaim them. And she had no doubt Karana was responsible, likely trying to cover her tracks, but she had more than enough chakra to meet her attempts with equal force. From the rear, Hinata followed up, lingering at the border of the fog. Her Bakugan blazing as she used her sight to keep an eye out for their target before breaking off, making her way around the field. Her eyes allowing her to move almost unfettered. I can smell her, Ka barked, and Akamaru yipped in confirmation alongside him, the wild berry smell standing out amongst the grass and grass. Directly ahead. Move in, she shouted. And Ka wasted no time in blitzing past her, his features returning to their feral appearance as he and Akamaru rushed straight ahead with great force. Let's go, Akamaru, he shouted. And Akamaru yipped before exploding in a puff of smoke that quickly dispersed, revealing another copy of the Inuzuka air, his own face twisted into a matching snarl of determination as the pair began to spin up into their clan's signature jutsu. Fang passing fang, The duo howled like war dogs as they bounded ahead like twin drills, punching a path forward with the force of their rotation, and the ground beneath them was ripped apart. Natsumi was forced to slow her pace lest she end up with a face full of dirt and debris from the maneuver. She was left in slight awe of the destructive potential of such an attack. The pair could likely drill through stone with that attack. She supposed it was a good thing the academy never allowed them to use clan techniques against one another. The twin drills tore ahead without mercy. And even though the now fading mist caught sight of a figure leaping out of the way of the devastating attack, she had little doubt over who it was, and so she quickly moved to intercept, pulling out and launching a kunai towards the shadowy figure as she shed in to engage. Kerr and I had no time to breathe after nearly being torn to pieces when her instincts practically screamed at her to move, and she sidestepped just in time to avoid a kunai to the neck before she was forced to bring an arm up in defense as a solid kick smashed into her side. Ruby eyes locked with Seruin for a split second before the two began to exchange blows. Kurenai may not have been a master of taijutsu, but she hadn't received her promotion for nothing and was still no slouch physically. Something Natsumi was quickly discovering as she began to get pushed back by the more experienced kunoiki. Narrowly ducking under a punch, Natsumi quickly brought up a chakra-cated hand. The gentle hum of deep azure energy coating her fingertips as she drew upon her main weapons for close-quarter combat. And suddenly, the flow of battle was in her favor as Karani quickly caught onto the new threat. She didn't have to be a medic nin herself to know that even a single nick from those scalpels could very well put her down if she wasn't careful. She needed to retreat and create some much-needed distance. Don't forget about us, she cursed. As Ka and Akamaru rejoined the fight, having recovered from their opening attack, she was suddenly left to contend with an onslaught from their slashing claws and the dangerous hiss of Natsumi's chakra bl. Addis. The only saving grace was that their teamwork was almost non-existent, and she had caught them having to pull back on more than one occasion to avoid accidentally hitting one another, which gave her room for some counters. Even so, they were putting up more than a fair fight. And given enough time, she had little doubt that they would be monsters when paired up. Rolling out of the way of desperate tackle, she quickly began to weave her hand through seals, hoping to trap one of them. But she was once again forced to abandon her plans as Natsumi switched tactics and fired off a narrow jet of pressurized water towards her position. The spray nearly hitting her head-on had she not jumped into the air in time to avoid it. However, she wasn't safe just yet as Ka and Akamaru followed her into the skies with claws drawn at the ready, and she barely had time to pull out a substitution that spared her the fate of a few nasty cuts, judging by the bits of wood that splintered off upon impact. She was beginning to think she'd given them a bit too much leeway. They might actually do her in at this rate. Oh. WWW. The Ravene hissed as pain shot through her right leg, and sparing a quick glance down revealed Tsunbi lodged deep into her leg. The twin bits of metal having sunk cleanly through her skin. She managed to quickly pluck them out just in time to avoid a foot to the face. As Natsumi wasted no time jumping back on her, beginning the engagement anew, but it quickly became apparent something was wrong. The more she moved, the heavier her leg began to feel, and she became aware of a creeping numbness that was slowly coursing through it that left her slightly off balance. It was becoming harder for her to guard her right side. Natsumi smirked as the paralytic agent began to do its job. It wouldn't do any lasting damage, but her tweaks to the formula made it far more efficient for combat purposes than the usual hospital varieties, since it activated far quicker and was more powerful, but the effects were not as lasting, especially given that she had not used very much, but it would suffice for this task. All they needed was to get her a bit closer towards Hinata. Kaisen, final push. She signaled it was time to wrap this up. Behind her, he grinned and nodded, leaping into the air already mid-spin as he aimed his attack. Passing Fang, he shouted, and she watched as he dive-bombed her position. As expected, Kurenai leapt back, and predicting her trajectory, she quickly ran through another set of seals puffed out her cheeks. Fire style, great fireball technique. Kerr and I watched the air in front of her come to a boil as the stream of fire left Natsumi's lips and took shape into a medium-sized glowing ball of heated gas and flame that charged forward towards her position. The air hissing as it began its race forward, and already her hands were forming the seals for another substitution passed. But she paused when, rather than continuing its flight, it instead collided with the earth a few meters in front of her, collapsing in a small heatwave and a brilliant explosion of light that forced her to bring up a hand to shield her eyes. Why? You're within range of my divination. Kurenai's eyes widened as Hinata leapt out of the mist, her fingertips glowing with chakra as she quickly closed the gap between them and lashed out with her clan's gentle fist style of taijutsu. She winced as those chakra-tipped fingers bored into her flesh, and immediately she felt her usually pristine chakra flow lurch as her tenketsu were gradually shut down. With her ability to dodge compromise, she had no choice but to take the full brunt of the attack. And it was only seconds later where she found herself on the ground surrounded by her new students who were cheerfully looking down upon her with grins, smirks, and smiles. I think this is our win. Yuhi-sensei, once she could stand again, thanks mostly to Natsumi and Hinata's help, the group had got heard in the center of the clearing where she could address them. I have to admit, I didn't expect you all to do as well as you did. You all made excellent use of your talents, and despite having not worked together much before today, you each managed to find your place on the team and execute your mission flawlessly. She praised them genuinely. It was rare for newly formed teams to perform this well, and she was anxious to see how they would do after a few months together. Safe to say you three completed the objective of the test, and so you've passed. Starting today, you are official members of Team 8 and fully fledged shinobi of Konoha. Hell yeah, Ka whooped with glee. Hinata smiled into her jacket in happiness that they'd passed. And Natsumi nodded in satisfaction and a bit of pride that everything had gone as smoothly as it had. I need to give my official report to the Hokage, so we'll break for today, but this is where we'll be meeting until we are assigned an official training yard. The village is just south of here, so you should have any trouble making it back. She gestured off where they needed to go. We'll be meeting up tomorrow bright and early at 8, so make sure you get a proper rest. She relayed and flashed him a proud smile. They had far exceeded her expectations. And with the proper guidance, each of them would grow to be splendid shinobi. She couldn't wait to see it. And chapter complete. Another slightly longer than usual chapter, though not by much. I am happy with how it turned out though, and I think it marks a good jump in action, seeing how Natsumi has grown and revealed a bit of the dynamic we're going to see with Team 8. I actually rewrote this chapter a few times because it always ended up being a bit more complicated than I thought was necessary. But I think this is a pretty solid wrap for this. Number 1, starting with teammate and Kurenai specifically. Let's begin with Kurani and the reason she was assigned to Natsumi. Now, I touch on this in the chapter, but I think it's clear that Natsumi has a lot of fallback abilities in the form of Jutsu, poisons, medical Enjutsu, and decent hand-to-hand skills. She's also very good at learning on her own for the most part. So I think it's fair to say that Natsumi is not in dire need of someone who can teach her a ton of things. What she is in need of, at least from the perspective of the Hokage, is some kind of attachment to the village. She needs friends, confidence, people she feels she can come to with anything, and of the teachers available at this moment, I think Karina is best suited for that role. How successful she'll be remains to be seen. Being on a team was an interesting experience to say the least. A little over a month had passed since the official formation of their squad. And true to her word, Karina had wasted little time in getting them adjusted to both one another and their new duties as a genin. While she had crafted a vague idea of what to expect from Orochimaru's notes, it had done little to prepare her for the tedium that was dank missions. Glorified chores or fetch quests that more often than not kept them confined within the village walls. And even when they did get to leave, it was never more than a mile out at best. To say she was disappointed would have been an understatement, but she wasn't all that surprised either. It was unreasonable to expect the village to allow its newest soldiers out into the field without giving them time to settle into their new roles and their new team dynamic. That was another change she was on the fence about. It was safe to say that she had conflicting feeling about the whole thing. It wasn't that she disliked them, per se. She was just unused to relying on others, and this newfound dependency on a team was less than comforting to her. Kurani seemed to be leaning hard into their search and detain methodology, and many of her team exercises forced her to rely upon Ka and Hinata if she wished to have any chance of success. That was not to say she didn't contribute her own skills, but the reality was she was not a tracker and no Amon. Of studying was going to give her better senses than an Inuzuka or the X-ray vision of a Hyuga. She suspected this was intentional on Kurana's part to force her to work with them, but there was little she could do to argue against it. They were a team and it was simply expected that they would be able to harmonize to an extent. That did not mean she had to like it, but for the sake of her advancement, she had to adapt, and so adapt she did. Solidifying her place on the team had been easy enough. Hinata had put up no argument in her rather direct installation as the de facto leader and strategist under Kurani, but Ka had been far less keen on giving up the potential position of leader so easily. This was something she had expected given the Inuzuka clan followed pack mentality, which could be as much of a curse as it was a boon. His loyalty was unquestionable, but like any member of a pack, the desire to lead was strong. He may not have been able to dethrone Kurana, but he sure could try and take the spot under her. The needless conflict had created some measure of tension between them until at last she decided that the best way to handle it was in a manner that would prove without a shadow of a doubt that she was in charge in a way that even his basest instincts would recognize. You want to fight me? Yes. She nodded and stepped forward, ignoring the look of worry shot their way by the third teammate, who was acting as the witness to this on her request. She had intentionally waited until Kurenai had left before making her move in case the woman tried to intervene in favor of a more peaceful solution, but this was far more direct and far more likely to end on her terms. But do you understand why I wish to fight you? Ka scratched his head. Not a clue, but I don't really need a reason to get into a scraps. I accept. He grinned ear to ear as if just the thought of battle got his blood pumping and she had to hold herself back from rolling her eyes lest she dilute the seriousness of her request. He probably had an instinctual understanding of the meaning behind her challenge but not a conscious one. Such was the nature of instincts. You accept, but you don't even understand what's on the line. She leveled him with a dull look as he blinked in confusion. I will keep this simple. You want to be our leader, do you not? She questioned, and without hesitation, he nodded. In his mind, this was a tracking team, and by that logic, a tracker should be in charge. Hinata wasn't suited for the position, so naturally, it should fall to him. A pack was led by the strongest, and given that he was always the muscle in their plans, it made sense he would shoulder that burden. Good. Then you should have no issues with this. She gave a disarming smile, one that, if anyone who was familiar with her saw, would likely say just didn't fit quite right on her face. I propose a wager to this fight. Then if you win, I'll stand down and follow you without question. No more back and forth. No more arguments. No more complaints. She laid out her terms, and she could see his eyes light up at the prospect of not having to butt heads with her at every turn, and that free reign of their team was being offered on a silver platter. However, she narrowed her eyes suddenly. If I win, then you will follow me. No questions, no arguments, no complaints. She held out a hand. Do we have a deal? She watched a slight flutter of hesitation dance in those dark eyes of his. Perhaps a blip of common sense that might have tried to warn him of the impending doom, but it was one that would go unheeded as the temptation to prove himself superseded the logical outcome of such a bet. She felt his hand grip hers tightly in a show of strength, and she refrained from meeting that challenge, allowing a false W to show on her face, an illusion of weakness that he would no doubt take as a reaffirmation that it was his strength that would carry him. Deal. Wonderful. Hinata-san, would you kindly be our witness? We wouldn't want the losing party to back out of their agreement now, would we? There should be some honor among teammates after all. She chimed, turning to face the mousy Hyuga, who was looking between the two with slight hesitation. Okay. But please don't go too far, Hinata pleaded, and she nodded. Of course, this is not a fight to death by any means. She waved off the concern. This match will end when one party either surrenders or is incapacitated, she explained, making it clear this wasn't about that would leave any one maimed, bruised and battered maybe, but she would heal anything too serious. I hope you're ready to lose. Or Sensei isn't here to hold us back now. Ka barked, reminding her that the academy had babied them quite a bit, but still she graced him with a knowing smirk in return and said nothing, merely making her way to the other side of the field in preparation. Once she had situated herself, she turned to face him, arms crossed above her chest and amusement dancing in her eyes. Believe me, she let out a short breath and in a single moment flexed her chakra. the air around her suddenly being lit aflame in a bright azure hue that left both of her teammates taken aback as they were buffeted by the rolling billow of dust that kicked up around her. Her live form bathed in a growing illumination of her own massive reserves. The atmosphere around them growing heavy with the pressure that came with allowing her control to slip for just a moment. She rarely enjoyed such needless displays of power. Shinobi was supposed to be unseen and stealthy, but sometimes a show of force was required, and judging by the look on her opponent's face, it had done its job. She needed to show the difference between them. I'm looking forward to testing my limits. Ka suddenly didn't seem as confident as he had at the outset, a sentiment Amaru echoed with a small whimper from his place hidden within the boy's hoodie, as he could practically taste the energy swirling in the air. A mistake had been made, but it was too late to back down. As expected, everything had gone accordingly, and she had dismantled him with minimal effort, knocking him around with a few elemental jutsu before finishing the fight with a few quick cuts to the tendons in his legs, rendering him essentially helpless. Of course, Akamaru had tried to help his master, but one look from her had silenced the pup and granted her the win. She took no real pleasure in beating them, to be clear. He wasn't an enemy, and he had done her no personal wrongs, but his instincts were problematic, and so they needed to be dealt with. Thankfully, Ka, for all his faults, was a man of his word. And while it wasn't overnight, their teamwork in the following weeks had improved vastly without the frictio over leadership weighing him down. While she was still reluctant to depend on others, she could at least trust him to do as she asked without having to keep an eye on him at all times. With the matters between her and Ka settled, at least for the moment, her attention had shifted to the less pressing but no less intrusive issue of her second teammate, specifically Hinata's utter lack of self-confidence. She knew the girl was reserved, but she was not aware of just how deep that timidness ran. She was like a baby deer, terrified of the world, and just one snap twig away from bolting into the forest, never to be seen again. If she was a civilian, this wouldn't be much of a problem. But she was a kunoichi, and such weak resolve only made her a flight risk, and that was something she would not stand for. She could not afford to have a teammate break down in the middle of a mission, or worse yet in the middle of combat. The question was, how did she correct that behavior? She wasn't a fool. Nobody withdrew into themselves that much without valid reason, and it lent credence to her idea that Hinata likely was cracking under the pressure of outside expectations. It was the one thing she herself did not have to deal with. No one expected anything from her, and so there was no one she could disappoint. But Hinata had a whole clan of people likely scrutinizing her every move. That was a lot of pressure to put on the shoulders of a child, and it wasn't as if the Hyuga clan was known for its kindness. She very much doubted Hinata had a particularly loving or supportive family, at least not in the traditional sense. Still, that didn't matter, and it wasn't her true concern. Her concern was what could she do to mitigate, if not outright, remove the issue. She decided to begin looking for answers in a subject she had touched on many years ago, but had ignored in recent months in favor of other studies, and that as psychology. There was no magic cord she could cut in the girl's pretty little head, so she would have to try something a bit more subtle, but something that couldn't be undone with a few harsh words from an outside party. Hinata suffered a lack of confidence both in herself and in her own abilities. However, she also seemed overly eager to please, given how she would throw herself into whatever task she was assigned. More than likely, that was her way of trying to prove her usefulness and maintain an image of competency in their eyes. But while that may prove useful within the safety of the village, such behavior had its risks out in the field. Still, it gave her a better idea of what kind of person she was working with. With all the data she had compiled, she was fairly confident that Hinata possessed what is known as a neurotic personality type, to some extent given the traits she displayed. Low tolerance for stress, a constant sense of self-consciousness, extreme vulnerability for the Aries of one of the most powerful and influential clans within the village. And while she did not have access to the girl's deepest thoughts, it was highly likely that she was a pessimist at heart, at least in regards to her own worth and ability. Without more data, she couldn't fully ascertain if she expressed any other tells such as depression and anxiety. But she wouldn't hold her breath if either or both were present within her. With that understanding, she had gained a better idea of how she should approach the problem. The issue was that to do so would push her out of her own comfort zone. What Hinata needed was a support system, but one that involved more than just a few kind words every couple of days. No, she needed someone she could talk to regularly, someone that she could feel safe around, and at the same me. Someone who wouldn't allow her to retreat back into bad habits or baby her. She debated bringing the matter to Kernai's attention since the woman seemed to figure some of this out instinctually and had taken a shining to the Hyuga girl, but it wasn't exactly what she needed. She wasn't firm enough with her. And so Hinata's poor habits continued to mount. Ka wasn't much of a better option either. Not only in that he often didn't think before he spoke, which could do far more harm than good, but also because she doubted he had the patience to deal with such a delicate matter for an extended period of time. That meant the duty fell to her and she had to come to terms with the fact she had little to no experience with the act of bonding. However, she couldn't afford to leave the matter be. Answer, if it meant a more reliable teammate and possibly a strong future ally, then perhaps the attempt may be worth the trouble. At least that's what she was hoping for. Why you want to have lunch with me? Hinata blinked at the sudden and unexpected request. A part of her immediately wanting to check and see if their sensei had trapped her in another genjutsu as part of their training since Natsumi never asked anyone to accompany her anywhere. It just wasn't a thing. Even in the academy, the girl had remained isolated by her own choice rather than a lack of popularity. But here she was standing in front of her and asking to have lunch. Have lunch with her of all people. If you have time, yes. Natsumi nodded and stretched herself out. They'd had physical conditioning today, so she was a bit more sore than usual. Her and I had shown some stretches that were better suited for kunoiki that she'd never heard of. Answer, even with her training, she was feeling the burn, so to speak. I believe it would be beneficial, but if you would rather not, I understand. And no, Hinata shouted before squeaking and covering her mouth in embarrassment, her eyes immediately falling to her feet. I mean I would enjoy that very much. She corrected, trying hard to bury her face within her jacket to hide the flush that had risen to her cheeks. Kami, she was an embarrassment to her family, but she couldn't help it. She idolized Natsumi, even if she would never say it, mainly because she was sure she'd faint before she could. But still, she admired her strength, her confidence, her demeanor, her ability. She was everything Hinata knew she herself wasn't. Natsumi never hesitated. She didn't doubt herself, and she never let anything or anyone get to her. She wanted to be like that. She'd be content to be even half the person Natsumi was if she was honest. Instead, she was weak, something that had only become more apparent the more time she spent with her team, and she was trapped between Ka's larger-than-life personality and Natsumi's self-assured attitude. She was the odd one out, a mouse walking at the feet of lions, and she hated it. But what could she do? Natsumi smiled softly and nodded. "Ts good. I know a nice little place we can eat at not too far from the village square. I hope it's to your taste, though I don't know how it might compare to what you're used to." She frowned and Hinata quickly shook her head, waving the concern off. Anything is fine, Anno. I'm not picky, and I'm sure it'll be fine. She reassured, not daring to offer any protest and risk losing this chance to better connect with her teammate. While there was little in the way of hostility between them, especially after Natsumi's bout for leadership with Ka, there was not much in the way of genuine camaraderie between them either. Something that had been rather disappointing for her if she was honest. Wonderful. Follow me then. I know a few shortcuts that'll help us avoid the midday rush. Natsumi said, making her out of the training yard with Hinata on her heels. At a respectable distance, of course. Of all the places she could have guessed that Natsumi would take her, a quaint little ramen stand was not exactly at the top of her list. It was a discreet establishment, a trait that fit well with Natsumi's own rather reserved personality. The atmosphere was pleasant enough, and the smell of noodles and spices hung lazily in the air, no doubt working empty bellies into a frenzy. All in all, it was a cozy little spot, and she would be lying if she didn't admit it had a welcoming vibe to it. Come on. Natsumi led her over to a pair of open stools by the counter, and the two quickly made themselves comfortable as they looked over the menus available. There were far more options than she was expecting. Just how many ways were there to prepare ramen? I hope you find something that appeals to you. They do serve other dishes outside of just ramen, but I think it's fairly obvious where their specialties lie. She noted idly, pretending to read through the menu, but her gaze would shift over to her lunch partner from time to time, taking a mental note of certain physical cues. A light flush upon pale cheeks, the slight jitter of her right leg, and even the idle trembling of her fingers. Nothing escaped her notice. Nothing could. Everything seems very good. Anno, do you have any recommendations? Recommendations. She rubbed her chin for a moment in thought. While I am partial to the miso bowl, one think you might enjoy the vegetable bowl a bit more. You don't strike me as a big eater. She assessed, and Hinata blushed and nodded. Hi. I don't eat very much at home, she confirmed, and Natsumi nodded, aloem escaping her lips. I thought not, though, now that we are gen, and I do expect you to eat more often. She leveled Hinata with a friendly but stern look. A healthy diet is important if you want to perform at your peak. And I would be rather concerned if you were to collapse on us, she noted casually, happily ignoring the slight widening of the quiet girl's eyes at the admission in favor of looking bar. CK down at her menu. I will try, she finally spoke after a moment. If you believe it will help. It is just a suggestion. You don't need to take me so seriously. She gave a burst wave of her hand and laid out her menu in front of her. Your performance has been more than satisfactory, so please don't take my words out of turn. She chuckled, and Hinata seemed to relax a bit at the gesture, her shoulders growing a bit less squared and tense as she began to grow more comfortable. One of the reasons she had chosen this specific establishment for the task at hand. The other reason should be arriving shortly. Well, now look who it is. A jovial voice interrupted the silent pair, and both turned to see a kind, older-looking man dressed in a white chef's uniform approaching their section of the counter. Little Sunsumi-chan has come to visit, and we have a newcomer. He seemed surprised for a moment, but quickly returned to his prior joviality. It took Hinata a moment to realize that he was addressing him, but when it clicked, her eyes swiftly darted towards her blonde Tiama. T with worry. Natsumi was not one for nicknames, and she half expected her teammate to rebuke the man with annoyance. But to her surprise, Natsumi seemed mostly content to allow such a causal address, though she did catch the slight rolling of her eyes. Tuki-san, she greeted politely, a twinge that could have been mistaken for a genuine smile poking up from the corner of her lips. I see your daughter has worn you down into using that ridiculous pet name. She noted disapprovingly, though, by her tone. It was clear that she wasn't all that surprised. It's cute. A feminine voice shouted from the back room, startling Hinata and prompting Natsumi to sigh. Tuki nodded in amusement. I never could say no to her, and she has a point. He laughed. Tisk. I do not wish to be cute. She scoffed, but there was no real heat to her protest. And despite herself, Hinata couldn't bite back a small giggle at the childishness of the statement. It painted such a different image from the more intense and frigid persona that the Uzumaki girl maintained in public, but it seemed that within the confines of these walls, she allowed herself a measure of comfort. She doubted that Natsumi would have been nearly as lenient towards anyone in their class if they had addressed her in such a way. Hey, as you say, Sumi-chan. The elderly chef chuckled before turning his attention over to the girl sitting by her side. I see you've brought a little friend with you. That's definitely a first, but a welcome one nonetheless. We were starting to get worried, you know. A girl your age needs friends. He lectured the blonde as if he were speaking to his own child. You should count yourselves lucky that your ramen is as good as it is, or I would remind you that I am a kunoiki now and not some little girl, she grumbled, releasing a resigned sigh and gesturing towards the girl by her side. This is my teammate, Hinata Hyuga. She was kind enough to join me for lunch today, so I would appreciate you not filling her head with misinformation, she explained, introducing the girl who bowed her low head in greeting. It is nice to meet you, San, Hinata greeted, and the older man smiled and bowed back in return. It is nice to meet you as well, Hinata-san. I don't know what you did to get little Sumi's attention, but keep it up. She needs a good friend. He joked, and Natsumi scowled at the color commentary. She wasn't a shut-in or anything like that. There was no need to exaggerate. Perhaps she should have gone somewhere a bit less familiar. Then again, Hinata did appear far more relaxed now, and that was the whole point of this. Exceptions would have to be made for now. Anyo, I don't think I've done anything of note. She tried to gently dismiss the idea. Not wanting to appear rude, but unwilling to pretend she had done anything to earn what appeared to be a prestigious honor. As far as the Uzumaki was concerned, she is competent, follows orders, and her skills are valuable, Natsumi interjected with a cough, turning attention away from their poking fun at her. I see nothing out of the ordinary with inviting such a person to share a meal, she said, eyeing the cook with a half glare. Of course, nothing unusual for you at all. Tuki met her glare with a knowing look, then shook his head and pulled out a piece of paper and pencil. Anyway, I do hope we see more of you in the future, Hinata S. But for now, let's get you two set up with some food. Do you know what you'll have? My usual is fine, Natsumi said, and he nodded. I'll have the vegetable bowl, please. Hinata said, all right, well get right to work. He grinned and left the pair alone to their own devices once more, the two falling into a somewhat awkward but comfortable silence. However, Natsumi noticed that Hinata appeared to be conflicted about something, her eyes shifting back and forth betway in her hands and up towards her before returning back to her fidgeting fingers. Is there something you'd like to say? Hinata S. She asked, and Hinata flinched within her seat, likely having not thought she'd be caught. I'm sorry, it's just. She paused for a moment, seemingly unsure of if she wished to pursue whatever thoughts plagued her further before continuing. Why you invite me here? She finally asked, turning her attention away from her hands and towards the blonde. We never speak outside of training, and I am not exactly good at sea conversation, she admitted, finally acknowledging the strangeness of the sudden invitation and the questions it brought forth. Natsumi merely hummed in response, falling silent for a few moments before speaking. I simply want to get to know you, she answered bluntly and predictably. Hinata's face contorted into one of confusion and underlying disbelief at the rather out-of-character answer. But before she could speak such thoughts, Natsumi continued, while I understand that may seem hard to believe given your history or lack of it, that is the truth. Though I have observed you long enough to know that you are likely thinking that there must be some ulterior motive or perhaps that you don't deserve such a thing. She guessed but kept her tone light to indicate she did not mean to accuse her. Hinata didn't say a word and instead averted her gaze, something she took as a clear sign that she had hit the nail on the head. I was not lying when I praised you earlier. She rested her cheek upon her palm and looked at the A's. From the day of our team's inception, you have always maintained confidence in my ability to lead, and you have never once disappointed or failed me. If anything, you always seem to put your all into your work, which I find admirable and reassuring, she noted, prompting the Hyuga to flush and poke her fingers together. She had not thought of how her actions might have appeared in the blonde's eyes. She had simply wanted to meet Natsumi's expectations, but she hadn't expected her to take notice. To know that she had was nice, comforting in its own way. I suppose it would not be a stretch to say that I have come to depend on you over the last month. Your assistance has been invaluable, and it's worth noting, she admitted openly, and she didn't even need to look this time to know that she had both Hinata's full attention and, more importantly, her sense of self-confidence in her hands. I am aware that I come off as slightly unapproachable. She grimaced openly at the blatant understatement, but carried on regardless. However, we are teammates, and I think it would be remiss of me to keep such unneeded distance between us. I've never been particularly gifted in the art of conversation myself, so perhaps making my intentions clear will help. Natsumi sat up and extended a hand towards her, her bandage's digits reaching halfway across the gap between them. What I'm really asking is, if you are willing, I would like to extend our relationship beyond being simple acquaintances. Rather, I think it would be far more beneficial to both of us if we could be friends. She laid out her request with a faint ghost of a smile making its way onto her face. Hinata could only stare at the bandaged hand being held her way before glancing back up towards the smiling face of her teammate. There were no words strong enough to describe the whirlwind of emotions running amok inside of her stomach, and she wasn't sure there ever would be. It was so surreal, like a dream, but the details were too precise. Everything was just too clear to be fake. If this was an illusion, she might actually never recover. She tentatively took the blonde hand, the firmness of Natsumi's grasp sealing the deal as the two joined palms in the symbol of newfound friendship, and a small smile of her own peeked past the hay-tee of her collar. Perhaps her team wouldn't be as cold as she initially thought, and that small spark of hope was enough to cement this choice as the correct one. Hi, if you will have me, I would like to be your friend. Natsumi's smile grew wider. Excellent. I'd propose a toast to such an event, but sadly they do not serve alcohol here, so we'll have to settle for water. She sighed deeply into her palm and Hinata laughed openly. The first time Natsumi had ever seen her do so, and she couldn't help but mentally pat herself on the back. Everything was going according to plan. Karma. Mission accomplished. Hokage-sama Tora has been captured and returned as requested. Kurani bowed respectfully towards their leader as she and her team turned in yet another mission for the day, their fifth if she was keeping track correctly. They were efficient to a fault, and that was one of the many things she enjoyed about her charges. No matter the task, they always got the job done with minimal issues, and she was proud to boast that Team 8 maintained a spotless mission record so far. Granted, they had only taken D-rank missions, but many would be surprised by the number of teams that somehow managed to fail even the simplest of tasks. She attributed much of her team's success to strong leadership, but it was not her leadership that often rallied them, but rather Natsumi's. From the academy reports, she had expected the girl to be something of a lone wolf, not keen to play well with others and perhaps even possessing a superiority complex given her status at the top of her year. It was not uncommon for supposed prodigies to be recluses as well. Examples like Kakashi and Itachi were proof enough of that. However, it quickly became clear that all of those predictions had proven to be unwarranted. Natsumi took a surprising level of interest in her team's well-being and had quickly established herself as the second in command of their squad. While it was still her job to give them orders, it was more often than not the blonde that would decide how those orders would be interpreted and in turn executed. That wasn't to say the girl was perfect, though. She could be a bit narrow in her thinking, and so she'd made it a point to challenge her with more creative and difficult tasks to expand her reasoning ability, and so far that was working rather well. However, it wasn't just Natsumi's actions that had surprised her, but it seemed almost as if overnight all her students had begun to make strides in bettering themselves or the team as a whole, and she had more than a sneaking suspicion that it had something to do with the blonde container. Her first clue came when Ka, the notoriously hard-headed member of their squad and rival for the position of team leader, suddenly backed off completely from his earlier behavior. No longer did he fight against Natsumi's orders as openly as he once did, and arguments between the two had grown significantly less frequent towards the latter end of their first month together. Being somewhat familiar with the Uzumaki clan and their habits, she knew such a change rarely occurred on its own, and so she'd quickly concluded that something had to have occurred between the two that solved the dispute of leadership. Given the personalities and the level of obedience Ka was displaying, she was inclined to believe the two had settled things with their fists instead of their words. A measure she didn't exactly approve of in most cases, but one that seemed to have worked out for the moment. She did, however, keep a close eye on the two of them to ensure that nothing got out of hand. The second, far more obvious clue came in the sudden shift in the dynamic between Hinata and Natsumi. The two had always been amicable enough, and it was easy for her to see that Hyuga girl held some measure of admiration for her skilled teammate, but her timid nature combined with Natsumi's forceful presence had prevented any meaningful connection between the two. They worked together perfectly well, but beyond that, they were strangers. Or at least that had been the case up until recently. Once again, it seemed as if Natsumi had been busy behind the scenes because the two were suddenly far closer than they'd ever been, which granted wasn't saying much, as they had barely even spoken to one another outside of meetings, but it was a noticeable change. Natsumi had slowly but surely begun to treat Hinata less and less like a stranger, striking up conversations, and had recently begun inviting her to train together outside of their meetings. And of course, she had immediately noticed the impact this sudden attention had on Hinata. The timid Hyuga was growing ever so slightly more confident in herself and her abilities, not drastically so by any means, but the signs were there. She began to speak more openly and suggest courses of action during team exercises, whereas before she'd been content to follow in the lead of her teammates. Her skills had benefited from this building perception shift as well, and her taijutsu was slowly improving. She was hesitating less in her attacks and bringing out the full nature of the gentle fist. A few more months with progress like this, and Hinata would almost certainly be a fierce opponent. With the growth and excellent teamwork, perhaps something a bit more challenging than chasing lost cats and pulling weeds would be appropriate. She would speak with the third about it soon. Natsumi pinched the bridge of her nose in annoyance as she watched her teammate struggle to keep his grip on the furiously flailing feline that was their target. Tora-chan, the famous or rather infamous pet cat of one Madame Shi, or as she was more commonly known, the daimyo's wife. The creature was not exactly fond of her master for various reasons, and as such had a nasty habit of not only running off, but also being a rather large thorn in the side of all fray. Shortly minted genin who were tasked with retrieving her. She was starting to notice, however, that more often than not, it was their squad that was assigned to capture the little devil, and it was beginning to wear on her nerves. Twice in one day was more than enough, but 3 times in an afternoon was ridiculous. Clicking her teeth, she easily seized the feisty cat by the scruff of her neck. Holding her like a newborn kitten and bringing it to her face, the struggling pet suddenly falling still as irate Seruan orbs bored deeply into her own beady black eyes, and a rather dense air of dread quickly enveloped the clearing like a suffocating miasma. Tori-san, I believe you had enough fun for one day. It is time to go home now. Her words were almost glacial in the delivery, sending visible chills down to his spine and all through her tail, her body falling limp, as if resigning itself to its fate. She was familiar with this human, and she knew that nothing her master could do would compare to the nightmares she would face at the hands of the little blonde girl holding her at the moment. Meow mulled weakly in surrender. I'll take that as compliance. Natsumi nodded and adjusted her hold of the cat to something a bit less degrading, securing her gently within her arms while brushing her fingers softly behind her twitching ears. Despite the feline's earlier fear, she smiled happily at the soft purr that escaped its throat under her ministrations. She did admit to having a small soft spot for animals. They could be as behaviorally complex and unique as any individual, yet their simplistic way of thinking oft made them far more rational in her opinion. That said, she wasn't going to spend the rest of the day chasing down a fretting house cat. How come she doesn't bite the hell out of you, but she uses me like some kind of scratching post? KBA scowled as he saddled up to them, his glare directed firmly towards the purring pest pressed happily against her chest. His face was covered in bright red scratch marks, and she could see some indents where Tora's teeth had punctured his skin. For such a small creature, she sure put up an admirable amount of fight. I'd wager she simply knows better. Natsumi pined, rubbing the back of Tora's neck with a slight smirk, a clear hint of amusement at his plight present within her voice. Perhaps if you didn't charge ahead like a rabid dog, you wouldn't end up under her claws. She pointed out, taking a small shot at his habit of leaping before he looked, something she'd been working to correct during their training. Yeah, whatever. Next time you can catch her then if you're so damn good at it. He huffed, far too occupied with the burning sensation in his face and hands to bother arguing with her. Could you heal these up already and allow you to grow reliant on my aid? I think not. Besides, I thought the Inuzuka enjoyed showing off their war wounds. She shook her head and began to make her way out of the clearing, leaving him to his suffering. I'd think a few scars from your clan's mortal enemy would be something worth taking pride in. She mocked, clearly referencing the well-known animosity between cats and dogs, and none too subtly, hinting that he learned a bit too hard into his canine roots. I'm not a dog, damn it, he shouted. Could have fooled me, she snorted. Now hurry up, Hinata-san and Karani-sensei are waiting for us, she chimed. They had other missions to run today after all, and they were wasting daylight. I hate you. I hope you know that. He growled childishly while running after her, knowing full well she'd leave him behind if he let her. Your hatred has been received and noted down to be reviewed at a later date. You can expect me to care at some point within the next 50 years or so. She drawled sarcastically. ARF. Akamaru peeked out of his master's hood with a wide grin stretched upon his snout. No, she did not win the argument. Hey hissed, turning his eyes towards his snickering partner. ARF. Akamaru seemed to rebut that statement, but sadly for her, she did not speak canine. Though, judging by the redness on Ka's face, his comments must have been less than flattering. Whose side are you on here? The winning side, clearly, she supplied, unable to help herself, having to fight down the urge to openly laugh at the groan of utter loathing that left his throat. Honestly, he was goated far too easily for a shinobi, but at least it provided her with ample amusement. Shut up. No one won anything. He argued, sure, Whatever you say, Car-san, well done, teammate. I'm sure madam she is more than pleased to have her beloved companion return to her again. The third offered them some light praise and a gentle smile towards the trio of genin before turning his attention on to their squad leader. The day is still young. Will you be taking on another mission? I do believe the Kichi family are looking for a few babysitters, he mentioned, gaze wandering over the many piles of D-rank assignments just waiting to be completed and somehow missing the looks of tense roar that settled over the assembled genin. For her part, Karani didn't even need to look at her team to know that they'd rather chase Tora for hours on end before they'd willingly babysit a few brought. Of the three, only Hinata truly had the disposition to deal with children, and even then, she didn't have the confidence needed to assert herself over the more rebellious ones. Ka was content to let them do whatever they wanted as long as they were screaming in his ear or dragging his partner by the tail, which wasn't exactly ideal in a sitter either. And as for Natsumi, why would you drug the baby? He wouldn't stop screaming, and he threw up on my shirt. Natsumi's voice held no remorse for her actions, and her features were schooled into an unreadable blank mask. However, there was a clear shine of vindictive glee that shone brightly in her eyes at her handiwork that proved she was less than remorseful about her actions. He is now sedate and content, which honestly is far better than he deserves. So I failed to see what the problem is. Karani had rarely been at a loss for words in her life. But right now she couldn't even begin to find the right words to express her inner thoughts at the sheer outlandishness of the situation. The leap in logic that somehow led to the end result of a 2-year-old lying face down on the floor blinking at nothing in particular haunting her. Just don't mention this to anyone ever. She sighed. She needed a drink and she needed it now. Of course, sensei, my lips are sealed. Needless to say, she made sure that they never took babysitting jobs again. Dismissing those thoughts with a short cough into her hand, Karani shook her head and addressed the aged Cage. Actually, sir, if I may, I would like to request a C-rank mission for my team if possible. She said suddenly, her words catching both her team and the third OFFG guard, having not expected such an abrupt request. And for a moment an uncomfortable silence fell over the room as the occupants digested the appeal. To his credit, the third recovered fairly quickly and hid any further expression behind a short puff of his pipe. That is certainly a fair request, but I must ask if you are sure that is what you want. His voice was level, but there was a measure of presence behind each word that made clear how serious he was. Your team has been in operation for less than 2 full months. Most would wait a little longer before seeking out higher-level missions. He noted mentally, recalling that neither Kakashi nor Osuma's teams had moved past Danks, and it didn't appear as if they'd be doing so anytime soon. Karani bowed her head in respect. I understand that it may seem a bit forward of me, but I believe my students are ready for something a bit more challenging. She spared him a quick side glance and flashed him a look of confidence before turning her attention back to her commander. Their teamwork is more than up to par, and individually they are all perfectly capable of handling themselves. I believe what they need most right now is experience, something they can't get from pulling weeds all day, she explained, making her case as to why she thought this was the right move. The third hummed quietly to himself in consideration of her words. The Inuzuka heir, the Hyuga clan, Ares, and of course, the prodigal Jinchuriki. A solid team led by one of his newest but clearly capable jonin. Kurenai wasn't known to rush into things unless she was confident there was a reasonable chance of success, which lent a fair bit of credence that truly believed her team was ready. If she thought they could handle it, then it seemed only fair to give them a chance to prove themselves. Very well. A leader must have faith in their subordinates, and clearly you trust in your students. The third nodded his approval. I do have a mission lined up that I think will be more than suitable for your needs if you are up for it. That is, he said, filtering through the piles of scrolls set up across the mission desk before grabbing the one he was looking for and tossing it over to the raven-haired jonin. Karani took a moment to look over the mission details and couldn't help but raise a brow in surprise before nodding and ulling the document back up. This is more than I was expecting, but I can't deny it'll be a good experience for them. Well, take it, she said. Excellent. I will send someone to fetch the client, and in the meantime, you can brief your team on the details downstairs. He replied quietly, motioning to one of his aides to begin making the proper preparations. Thank you, Hokage-sama. She nodded appreciatively, then turned to her team. Follow me, Kama. I can't believe we're getting our first C rank. KBA practically howled in anticipation the moment they were out of earshot of the mission hall, his face nearly split in two by the wild grin that had settled upon it. Sensei, you are the best. He cheered, pumping a fist in excitement. Hinata giggled softly at his enthusiasm and pressed her fingers together in a mixture of happiness as well as slight anxiety. Thank you for believing in your sensei, she stuttered, inwardly pleased that the ruby-eyed Jonin had felt confident enough to request a better mission for them, even if Shush. Yi wasn't fully sure she was ready for such a thing. She still trusted the ruby-eyed woman's judgment. Kerr and I gave a soft smile and placed a reassuring hand upon Hinata's shoulder, her way of letting the girl know that she believed she was ready. You three earned it on your own. I wouldn't have requested the mission if I didn't think you could handle it, but you've been working so hard and you've made good progress as a team. If you want to thank anyone, then you'd best thank yourselves. Natsumi hummed her own approval, happy to see that their efforts were being recognized. But ever the pragmatic soul, her attention swiftly returned to the source of their celebration. Sensei, are you going to tell us about the mission now? She asked, her natural curiosity and childish excitement flaring up a bit as she quietly began to imagine just what sort of task they'd been given. Hopefully, it was something that would get them out of the village for a time. Of course. Karani nodded and pulled out the scroll containing the details of their assignment and unfurled it. Now, to be clear, this mission isn't anything too fancy, so don't go getting your hopes up. Quote. She wanted, and as she said that, she shot a pointed look towards Ka, who had the decency to rub his arm rather sheepishly at being figured out so quickly. That being said, you three definitely lucked out for your first real assignment, since this job is going to take us farther than I'd have expected. She paused for a moment and they all leaned in to hear just where they would be headed. To keep it brief, I hope you all like the heat because this assignment is taking us all the way out to Sanaga, she revealed, and the sound of a pin dropping could be heard over the rush of disbelieving silence. They were going where? The hidden sand village. Natsumi could hardly believe it to think that her first real assignment outside the bounds of the village would be to a completely different village, and not just any random shandy town, but one of the 5 major ones. Naturally, she was familiar with Sonaja from her studies and knew that it was the only major village they were currently explicitly allied with, which explained how they'd landed such a low-ranking mission to travel there in the first place. Other than that though, she knew scarcely little about it as a whole, just that the people there were known for being particularly hearty given the less than inviting conditions they resided in. She couldn't have asked for a better mission. Honestly, there was so much for her to learn. Our task will be to escort our client to the village and guard him until his business there is complete. Karani continued her explanation after giving him a few moments to digest the news. Once he is ready, we are to escort him back here, whereupon we'll have completed our mission successfully. She finished briefly summarizing their task and they all had to agree that on paper the mission wasn't anything too grand. This job is expected to last about a week and a half or so, with travel time being factored in. Normally, I'd tell you to pack extra carefully since we'll be out for so long, but given that we'll be spending a few days in the sand village, we can afford to pack a bit lighter as we'll be able to purchase more supplies as needed. She surmised and they nodded. That made sense. They wouldn't be roughing it in the wilds for the entire time, so no need to bog themselves down. Still, she'd make sure to pack appropriately for travel through the desert. You never knew what could go wrong, and the idea of burning up out in the sands wasn't exactly an appealing prospect. Do keep in mind that this is sooner. We are talking about saying it's going to be hot is an understatement. So remember that as you make your preparations. She sent them all a serious look that spoke volumes on just how bad it could be out there. Hinata Ka, I know you two are partial to wearing jackets, but you are going to need some lighter clothing if you don't want to overheat, she said, and the pair nodded in understanding, already making mental note to switch up their wardrobes. When will we be setting out? Natsumi asked, wondering what the timetable was for this assignment. The details say we'll be leaving in 2 days from now. The client supposedly has something to take care of here before we head out, so that gives you 3 an extra day to prepare if need be. She answered, we'll be sleeping on the road at some point, so make sure to grab a tent to camp in for the night. When we get to the village, I'll handle the lodging costs, so you don't need to worry about money too much, unless you'd like to pick up some souvenirs. A knock at the door to the waiting room interrupted any further conversation, and their attention was shifted towards the entrance where they saw a man who they could only assume to be their client making his entrance. He was a rather tall individual, standing well above Karana in height at around 5 feet 10. He was clearly a traveler, judging by his rugged appearance as well. Tan skin turned almost bronze from hours spent under the sun, and a hearty build that spoke of years of physical activity made it clear that this was a man used to being on the move. His clothing seemed equally as worn as he was. A plain brown V-neck shirt with short sleeves, matching pants, and a pair of sturdy sandals for traveling. Feature-wise, he was nothing remarkable either. Short, messy black hair and equally dark eyes that danced around the room, taking in everything around him. A youthful but clearing aging face that hinted towards him being in his late 20s, perhaps early 30s. Nothing truly special or unique, but then again, most clients weren't anything to write home about. "Hello, are you the ninja I hired?" he asked. His voice was gruff but polite. "Are you Kenji Takahiro?" Karani questioned, and seeing him nod, she smiled. "Then yes, Matam and I will be the ones accompanying you on your trip," she said, confirming his suspicions and extending a hand in greeting, which he took happily. "I see. Thank you for taking on my request. I appreciate it," he said graciously. "As you know, my name is Kenji Takahiro. You may call me Kenji or Tokahiro, whichever you prefer." He then gestured their way, hinting that he was waiting for them to introduce themselves next. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Tahiro-san. My name is Kurane Yui and the three here are my squad." She introduced politely and prompted her charges to step forward and make their own introductions. Hinata stepped forward first and bowed her head towards the man in respect. "Hello, my name is Hinata H. Hyuga," she greeted him respectfully. "It is nice to meet you," she finished demurely, and Kenji nodded, taking her hand in a very gentlemanly fashion, prompting Hinata to squeak a bit at the unfamiliar treatment. But she quickly composed herself and finished the shake before stepping back to allow the rest of her team to greet their client. True to his nature, Ka held nothing back in his own introduction. "Nice to meet ya," he greeted boisterously, his usual fang grin on full display. "I'm Ka and this here is my partner Akamaru," he introduced, lifting his hood up a tad to reveal the white pup resting on his head, who waved and barked in his own greeting. Kenji appeared slightly taken aback at the forceful introduction, but recovered well enough, and the two clasped hands in a firm handshake. Seeing as it was her turn, she stepped forward and nodded her head in acknowledgement. "Good afternoon. My name is Natsumi Uzumaki. I hope we will meet your expectations," she said politely, and just as he'd done with Hinata, he shook her hand rather delicately, something that amused her given she could probably break his hand with a quick flex. But then again, civilians often didn't understand the difference in strength between themselves and even a half-trained genin. Either way, at least he was polite, so she wouldn't complain. "It's nice to meet you all," he said with a warm smile, seemingly pleased that he'd landed a friendly enough G-Rup for his travels. "I assume you've gone over the details already?" he asked. And at that, they all nodded, and he clapped with approval. "Great, then I won't bore you with too many details. As you know, I have a little business opportunity going down in Suna, and I'd rather not disappear on my way there, so I'll be relying on you lot to keep me safe." "Are you expecting trouble?" Natsumi asked curiously. It almost seemed as if he was expecting something to go wrong from the way he spoke. "When you've been wandering the roads as long as I have, you learn to always expect trouble," he answered sagely, but after a small pause, he shook his head. "But to be honest, no, I'm not really expecting anything more than perhaps a few roadside bandits at worst. I'd just prefer to be safe than sorry," he explained, making it clear that they shouldn't expect anything too dangerous along the way. "Don't worry, we'll make sure you make it there and back in one piece," Karani assured. "I'll hold you to it. Is there anything else you need to know about the job?" he asked. "I believe we have everything we need for the moment," she replied, turned her attention to her students. "You three are dismissed for the rest of the day. We won't meet again until we're set to leave, so make sure to use that time wisely. We'll set off from the main gate at 7 sharp, so don't be late," she clarified, giving them their final instructions before dismissing them to prepare. Less to say, they were quick to be on their way. Let it never be said the prospect of a new adventure wasn't a good motivator. Her first stop upon leaving the mission office had been a straight shot to the library. Since she knew that she had all of tomorrow to prepare her things, she decided that it would be a good idea to do some extra research into her coming destination beforehand to avoid any culture shock and to get a general layout of the area just in case. Thankfully, there was plenty of material on the subject, and it hadn't even taken her more than a couple of minutes to amass a sizable collection of knowledge to skim through, ranging from the region's history, important landmarks, and some of the common dangers they might encounter. Taking a look at its past, Sanaga had apparently been founded sometime after the Waring States period, a little while after the Shoai himself had founded Konoha. The Shoai Kage, a man by the name of Reito, had managed to rally the nation's wandering shinobi through displays of power and the promi Shei of a stable home to provide safety. This coalition would eventually grow sizable enough to form the Sonaja that existed in her time. However, it appeared that fate was not always kind to the people of the Sands, and at some point, Reito was assassinated. Unfortunately, there was little information available on the circumstances surrounding the incident, which was more than a bit disappointing. Looking into the reign of the second Kage, her interest was piqued as she discovered that he appeared to be a researcher at heart. Though that wasn't to say he was not a firm military leader as well. Under his rule, Suna had shifted its focus almost entirely towards improving its military might by artificially inflating its fighting forces. He did this by drilling down into one of Suna's most prized and well-known practices, the art of puppetry. Their shinobi possessed a talent for using life-sized puppets in combat. A fighting style marked by trickery and deception that many unsuspecting shinobi had fallen prey to despite how seemingly unconventional a method of engagement, it was due to underestimating the utility of such tools. The hope had been to minimize the loss of life by using these puppets to engage enemies. And seeing as the practice had survived into the modern day, she supposed it had to have been somewhat successful in its task. In an interesting note, Shaman I's true name had also been assassinated. And it was this act that birthed a building superstition that claimed the lineage of Kage to be cursed. From there, the village had not been particularly active on the world stage, at least not any more than Saint of the major nations were. Small skirmishes and some territorial disputes, sure, but overall nothing of major note up until the Third Shinobi World War. And even then, it was less about what they did and more about what occurred during that time. The third Kage's reign was short, but even so, he was considered to be the strongest Kage the village had ever seen. And he'd achieved this by mastering an ability known as Satatsu, or iron sand, a skill that had granted him the ability to manipulate fine iron powder-like grains of sand that he could then shape and bend at will. A prospect she found utterly fascinating in its application. The possibilities were endless with enough control. Clouds of iron powder that could enter an enemy's lungs and then be called upon to tear them apart from the inside. Weapons of all shapes and sizes, shields, or even entire functioning structures. The versatility alone was awe-inspiring, and she couldn't help but imagine what she could do if she herself possessed such an ability. Realizing she was getting off track, she quickly read the rest of the entry on the third, which honestly wasn't much. He had apparently been a rather private individual, and so information on him was scarce. So much so that she hadn't even been able to find so much as a name. Deciding that she'd looked into more than enough of the village's history, she moved her attention towards general information that might aid her and found some small tidbits of information she could use. The vast desert that surrounded the village was apparently home to many different types of poisons, plants, and venomous creatures that would make a fine addition to her arsenal if she could just get a hold of them. She'd have to see about getting a pass to explore on her off time, as she couldn't let a chance like this just slip through her fingers. The rest of the information she had gathered was sadly less interesting, though no less helpful advice for traveling through the desert and warding off the less and welcoming wildlife that skulked across the sands were useful, but not all that engaging to read about. And so she settled for withdrawing just 2 books on the local plants and endemic life for good measure before heading out to further prepare. By the time she'd left the confines of the library, the sun had nearly set. She really needed to be more mindful of the time in the future. Yo, Natsumi, she paused mid-step at the sound of her name being called. The number of people who would think to call to her so casually flashing through her mind for a moment before a match clicked, and a small smirk climbed its way onto her face, and she turned. Naran, she slowed her pace to a crawl, allowing him to catch up with her. It appeared as if he was on his own at the moment, as she could not either Ino or Choji accompanying him. I did not expect to run into you this evening. What are you doing out so late? She asked. I'm out with my pops to run some errands. He explained with a shrug. What are you doing here? His eyes fell to the books clutched in her arms. Were you at the library again? He questioned, knowing that she spent much of her free time reading when she could. I was. I needed some information for an upcoming mission and I just happened to lose track of time. She admitted, and he raised a brow in curiosity. What kind of mission could she possibly need to do research for? Seeing his confusion, she clarified her meaning. We have just received our first C-rank mission. We set out in a few days, and I thought it prudent to have a better understanding of what to expect while we are away, she said. A small amount of pride leaking into her voice as she caught sight of the ways his eyes widened in surprise. A C-rank mission already. He shook his head in exasperation. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. This is you were talking about. He sighed. If anyone was going to be first, it would be your group. I'll take that as a compliment. She chuckled idly, noting that the two had begun walking aimlessly since the start of their conversation, and she was now farther away from her home than she'd intended. But she supposed it couldn't be helped. Speaking of teams, how are things with yours? She inquired. Troublesome. The word left his mouth like it had been sitting there just waiting to come out, and she couldn't stop herself from clicking her teeth at the typical Naro response. She swore that word made up half of his vocabulary. Be specific. Troublesome isn't a valid answer. They're all right, I guess, he conceded, throwing his arms up over his head. Shoji and I get along just fine, like we always have, and Ino is still as bossy as ever, so it's not like much has changed. Since the academy, our sensei isn't a hard ass, which is nice, but he can be kind of a pain when he wants to be, so it's a mixed bag. He rubbed the back of his neck. Overall, it could be worse, so I can't really complain. How could it be worse? His team seemed to fit him perfectly by the way he described it. He shot her an amused glance. I could have been stuck with you, he pointed out, and she scoffed in annoyance at having walked into such an obvious setup. She should have guessed he'd say something like that. Keep digging that hole of yours, Naran. I'll be happy to bury you in it one day, she warned, a strange mixture of playfulness yet deadly seriousness in her voice that left him chuckling rather nervously, a small bead of sweat rolling down his neck. As he remembered just who he was talking to. That was a joke. I was kidding. She didn't say anything for a while, content to let him sweat a bit before finally allowing a small laugh to bubble out from her chest, assuring him that she had no plans of ditching him a shallow grave somewhere. At least he hoped that was the case. The two spent a bit longer enjoying casual conversation before she acknowledged that she needed to get home before it got too late. She had to admit that this unexpected outing was rather enjoyable. Perhaps there was something to be said for entertaining the company of others outside more often. She would resolve to try such a thing with her team at some point. Bidding him farewell, she began the walk home. I thought you said girls were troublesome. Shikamaru jumped as the amused voice of his father spoke out suddenly by his side. The elder Naru looking down at his son with something akin to surprise and mirth. It had taken him by surprise to see Shikamaru leave his side out of the blue, but he hadn't thought much of it until 20 minutes had passed and he hadn't returned, deciding that facing his wife without their son wasn't worth the trouble. He'd gone looking for him only to find him accompanying none other than the village pariah on an aimless walk through the market. He had nothing against the girl, to be clear, but he'd also never steered Shikamaru towards her either. He did remember that Shikamaru had mentioned her a few times in passing, but he'd not taken them for close friends by any means. However, it seemed as if they were much closer than he'd initially thought. Don't do that, Shikamaru scowled at his father, placing a hand over his chest. And she is troublesome, but she's not as bad as most women. He corrected, turning to face his father, who let out a short laugh at his son's roundabout way of saying she wasn't awful. If you say so, Shikaku chuckled, placing a hand on his shoulder. Now come on, we're late because of you, and I'm not getting chewed out by your mother alone. The pair shuddered and with twin sighs of resignation began the long walk home to the lecture they were both surely going to receive. So guys, what do you think about this Naruto story? Tell me your opinion in the comments. And if you want more Naruto what if stories, make sure to subscribe to Universe of Naruto. Thanks for watching.